the ominous invitation. It was October 27th, 2023, a Friday. The air in Boston was thick with the promise of autumn, leaves swirling in reds and golds down Beacon Street. But for Sarah Walker, the beauty of the season was lost in a fog of stress. A 42-year-old architect, Sarah had been burning the candle at both ends, juggling a demanding career and the recent, painful end of a long-term relationship. Her friend, Emily Carter, a vibrant art therapist, had been relentless in her insistence that Sarah needed a break. "You're going to collapse, Sarah. Get out of the city. Breathe some fresh air," Emily had urged over countless late-night phone calls. Finally, Sarah had relented. She'd booked a weekend at a secluded cabin in Havenwood, a small town nestled in the Berkshires, about a 2-hour drive west of Boston. The online listing for the Whispering Pines cabin had been deceptively charming. Photos showed a cozy, rustic retreat with a stone fireplace, surrounded by a dense forest. The reviews were glowing, filled with praises for the cabin's tranquility and the stunning natural beauty of the area. "Perfect place to recharge," one reviewer had written. Sarah desperately hoped they were right. She left Boston around 6 in the evening, the sky already darkening. Traffic was predictably awful, the usual Friday exodus from the city. What should have been a 2-hour drive stretched into nearly 3. By the time she finally turned off the main highway onto the winding road leading to Havenwood, it was almost 9 o'clock. The temperature had plummeted. A bone-chilling wind buffeted her small SUV as she navigated the narrow, unlit road. Towering trees clawed at the sky, their branches skeletal against the inky blackness. Sarah felt a prickle of unease, a sense of isolation that the online photos hadn't conveyed. Following the GPS, she eventually arrived at the address. The Whispering Pines cabin was even more secluded than she'd imagined. It sat at the end of a long gravel driveway, completely hidden from the road. As she pulled up, the headlights illuminated the cabin. It was smaller than she expected, and the charming rustic facade seemed to have a layer of neglect clinging to it. Sarah hauled her suitcase and a small bag of groceries from the car, the wind whipping around her. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and pine needles. As she fumbled with the key in the lock, a shiver ran down her spine. It wasn't just the cold. There was something else, something unsettling about this place. The moment she stepped inside, the feeling intensified. The cabin was dimly lit, with a single lamp casting long, distorted shadows. The air was stale and musty, as if the cabin hadn't been occupied in months. The promised cozy interior felt cramped and unwelcoming. She tried to dismiss her unease. Long drive, tired, unfamiliar surroundings. That's all it was. Sarah walked through the small living room, noticing the worn furniture and the dust coating every surface. The fireplace, which had looked so inviting in the photos, was filled with cold, gray ash. The kitchen was equally disappointing, the appliances old and grimy. She quickly unloaded her groceries, shoving them into the sparsely stocked refrigerator. Then, she found the thermostat and cranked up the heat, hoping to dispel the chill that had settled deep in her bones. She decided to unpack and settle in, anything to distract herself from the growing sense of dread. As she hung her clothes in the small bedroom closet, she noticed something odd. Scrawled on the back wall, barely visible in the dim light, were a series of symbols. They looked like ancient runes or maybe some kind of obscure religious script. She couldn't decipher them, but they sent another shiver down her spine. Ignoring the symbols, Sarah found a book and curled up on the couch with a cup of tea. It was a thriller, hoping to get lost in its pages. Just as she was starting to relax, a loud creak echoed from the hallway. Sarah tensed, her heart pounding. She held her breath, listening intently. Silence. Probably just the old house settling, she told herself. But the feeling of being watched persisted. Around 11 o'clock, exhausted but unable to shake her unease, Sarah decided to go to bed. She turned off the lights, the cabin plunging into near-total darkness. As she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, she heard it again. A faint scratching sound, coming from outside the window. She pulled the covers up to her chin, trying to ignore it. but the scratching grew louder, more insistent. It sounded like fingernails scraping against the glass. Fear seized her. Sarah knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the core, that she was not alone. Something was out there watching her, waiting. Sarah lay frozen in bed, every nerve on high alert. The scratching continued, a relentless, unnerving sound that drilled into her brain. She wanted to scream, but her voice seemed trapped in her throat. Finally, she couldn't take it anymore. She had to see what was making the noise. Slowly, cautiously, she reached for the bedside lamp and switched it on. The sudden light momentarily blinded her. She crept to the window, her heart pounding against her ribs. With trembling hands, she pulled back the curtain just a crack. Standing outside, illuminated by the weak porch light, was a woman. She was tall and gaunt, with long, stringy black hair that obscured most of her face. She wore a tattered, old-fashioned dress that looked like it belonged to another era. Her eyes, though, were what truly terrified Sarah. They were wide and vacant, filled with an unnerving emptiness. They seemed to bore into her soul. The woman raised a hand and pressed it against the window. Her fingers splayed against the glass. The scratching stopped. She stared at Sarah, her expression unreadable. Sarah recoiled, stumbling backward. She wanted to slam the curtain shut, but she was paralyzed with fear. The woman's gaze held her captive. After what felt like an eternity, the woman spoke. Her voice was raspy and hollow, like the rustling of dry leaves. "Help me," she croaked. "Please, you have to help me." Sarah didn't know what to do. Every instinct screamed at her to stay away, to lock the doors and hide. But there was something in the woman's voice, a desperate plea that tugged at her conscience. Gathering her courage, Sarah edged closer to the window. "What's wrong?" she managed to ask, her voice trembling. "My car," the woman rasped. "It broke down, back on the road. Miles, I need to call for help." Sarah hesitated. Something didn't feel right. Why would a woman walk miles in the middle of the night, in this freezing weather, instead of staying with her car? And how did she even know someone was staying at the cabin? It was so secluded, hidden away from everything. I don't know," Sarah stammered. "It's late. I'm not sure I can help you." The woman's expression changed. The pleading look vanished, replaced by a cold, hard anger. Her eyes narrowed, and her lips twisted into a sneer. "You will help me?" she hissed, her voice suddenly sharp and menacing. "You have no choice." Sarah felt a surge of adrenaline. This wasn't a stranded motorist. This was something else, something dangerous. She had to get rid of her. "I'm sorry," Sarah said, her voice gaining strength. "I can't help you. There's a gas station about 15 minutes back on the main road. You can find a phone there." The woman stared at her for a long moment, her eyes burning with hatred. Then, without another word, she turned and vanished into the darkness. Sarah watched her go, her heart pounding in her chest. She slammed the curtain shut and locked the window, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She backed away from the window. She knew, with a certainty that sent a chill down her spine, that she had made a mistake. The woman wasn't going to leave her alone. Sarah spent the next hour huddled in bed, listening to every creak and groan of the old cabin. She double-checked all the locks on the doors and windows, reinforcing them with chairs and anything else she could find. She tried to convince herself that she was overreacting, that the woman was just a desperate traveler who would eventually give up and go away. But deep down, she knew that wasn't true. There was something unnatural about the woman, something that defied explanation. She considered calling the police, but what would she say? That a strange woman had asked to use her phone? They'd think she was crazy. Besides, the woman was gone now. There was no proof that anything had even happened. Despite her fear, exhaustion eventually overcame her. She drifted off to sleep, but her dreams were filled with dark shadows and haunting whispers. She dreamed of the woman's vacant eyes, her raspy voice echoing in the darkness. She woke with a start around 3 in the morning, drenched in sweat. The cabin was silent, but the air felt heavy, charged with an unseen presence. She lay in bed, listening intently, but she heard nothing except the gentle rustling of the wind in the trees. She tried to go back to sleep, but her mind was racing. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She glanced at the window, half expecting to see the woman standing there, but the curtain remained still. After tossing and turning for what felt like hours, Sarah decided she couldn't stay in bed any longer. She got up and went to the kitchen, hoping a cup of tea would calm her nerves. As she waited for the water to boil, she glanced out the kitchen window. The backyard was shrouded in darkness, the trees casting long, eerie shadows. She strained her eyes, trying to penetrate the gloom. Then she saw it, a flicker of movement, just at the edge of the woods. Something was out there, lurking in the shadows. Sarah froze, her breath catching in her throat. She stared intently at the spot, trying to make out what she was seeing. It was too dark to be sure, but it looked like a figure, standing motionless among the trees. She watched for what seemed like an eternity, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there, silent and still, as if waiting for something. Sarah felt a wave of panic wash over her. She wasn't imagining things. Someone or something was out there, watching her. She grabbed a knife from the kitchen drawer, her hand trembling. She knew it wasn't much of a weapon, but it was all she had. She held it tightly, her knuckles white. The water finally boiled, but Sarah had lost all desire for tea. She turned off the stove and backed away from the window, her eyes fixed on the shadows in the woods. She knew she couldn't stay in the kitchen. It was too exposed, too vulnerable. She needed to find a safer place to hide. Slowly, cautiously, she backed her way into the living room, her eyes never leaving the window. She reached for her phone, intending to call for help, but her fingers fumbled with the buttons. Just as she was about to dial, the lights went out. The cabin plunged into total darkness. Sarah gasped, dropping the phone. She was completely blind, disoriented, and terrified. She heard a noise outside, a soft rustling sound that seemed to be getting closer. The shadows in the woods were moving. Sarah knew with a chilling certainty that whatever was out there was no longer content to watch. It was coming for her. The sudden darkness was disorienting, complete, and absolute. Sarah fumbled for her phone on the floor, panic rising in her throat. She found it, her fingers trembling as she tried to unlock the screen. The phone flickered to life, the screen casting a weak, pale glow in the darkness. She quickly dialed 911, her heart pounding against her ribs. The phone rang, each ring echoing in the silent cabin like a death knell. Finally, someone answered. 911, what is your emergency? A calm, professional voice asked. I need help, Sarah stammered, her voice shaking. I'm at a cabin in Havenwood. Someone's outside. I think they're trying to break in. What is your address, ma'am? The operator asked. Sarah recited the address, her voice barely above a whisper. Please hurry, she pleaded. I'm scared. We're dispatching officers to your location, the operator said. Stay on the line with me. Can you describe what's happening? As Sarah started to explain, a loud thud shook the cabin. The sound came from the front door. They're here, Sarah gasped. They're trying to get in. The operator's voice remained calm. Stay calm, ma'am. Are you able to barricade the door? Sarah tried to move towards the front door, but another thud sent her stumbling backward. The door rattled in its frame. I don't think I can, she said, her voice rising in panic. It's an old door. It won't hold for long. The thuds continued, growing louder and more frequent. Sarah could hear the wood splintering around the door frame. Ma'am, listen to me, the operator said. Is there another way out of the cabin? Sarah remembered the back door in the kitchen. Yes, she said. There's a back door. I can try to escape. Do it now, the operator urged. Get out of the cabin and run as far as you can. Don't stop until you reach the main road. Sarah took a deep breath and started to move towards the kitchen, her eyes fixed on the front door. The rattling grew more intense. She could hear grunting and muffled curses as whoever it was threw their weight against the wood. Suddenly, there was a loud crack, and Sarah knew the door frame was starting to splinter. She had to get out now. She ran to the kitchen, grabbing her car keys from the counter. The back door was closer, and she figured it was her best chance at escape. As she fumbled with the lock, she heard the front door finally give way with a resounding crash. The sound echoed through the cabin, sending a jolt of terror through her. Heavy footsteps pounded through the house. Sarah didn't wait to see who was coming. She threw open the back door and burst outside, not even bothering to close it behind her. The bitter cold hit her like a slap to the face, but she barely noticed as she sprinted towards her car. The gravel crunched beneath her feet as she ran, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Just as she reached for the door handle, a hand grabbed her shoulder. Sarah screamed, whirling around. She saw a figure looming over her in the darkness, its face obscured by shadows. It was tall and malevolent, its eyes glowing with an unholy light. She didn't have time to think. Survival instinct took over. She raised her car keys and plunged them into the figure's face, twisting them with all her might. The figure screamed, a guttural, inhuman sound that sent shivers down her spine. It released its grip on her shoulder and stumbled backward. Sarah didn't wait to see what would happen next. She dove into the car, slamming the door shut and locking it. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely get the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, shattering the silence of the night. Sarah threw the car in reverse and floored it, tires squealing as she fishtailed out of the driveway. She kept glancing in the rearview mirror, terrified she'd see headlights gaining on her. But the road behind remained dark and empty. She didn't know who or what she had attacked, but she knew she had to get away. She drove as fast as she dared on the winding road, her headlights cutting through the darkness. The trees seemed to close in on her, their branches clawing at the car as she sped past. Her mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Who was that woman? What was that thing in the woods? And why were they after her? She couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a random attack. There was something supernatural about it all. The woman's vacant eyes, the strange symbols in the closet, the figure's inhuman scream. It all pointed to something beyond the realm of ordinary reality. As she drove, she noticed something strange in the rearview mirror. Two glowing red eyes were visible in the distance behind her car. Her skin crawled with fear. It was the thing that had been in the woods. She pressed down harder on the accelerator, pushing the car to its limits. The wind howled around her, and the trees blurred into a green tunnel. She drove for what felt like hours, not stopping until she reached the next major city, Pittsfield. Only then did she pull over at a brightly lit gas station, her body shaking with exhaustion and fear. She stumbled out of the car, her legs weak and unsteady. She went inside the gas station and collapsed into a chair, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The gas station attendant, a young man with a bored expression, looked at her with concern. "Are you okay, ma'am?" he asked. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Sarah couldn't speak. She just shook her head, tears streaming down her face. The attendant handed her a cup of coffee and a blanket. "Here," he said. "This will help you calm down." Sarah gratefully accepted the coffee, her hands still shaking. She took a sip, the warm liquid soothing her raw throat. After a few minutes, she managed to regain some composure. She pulled out her phone and called the police, her voice trembling as she recounted what had happened. They took her statement and said they'd send officers to investigate the cabin, but warned her that without any real evidence, there wasn't much they could do. They treated her with skepticism, as if they didn't believe her, and told her it's best if she got some sleep. Sarah ended up checking into a cheap motel for the rest of the night, too shaken to continue driving. Sleep was impossible. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw that woman's face at the window, heard the sound of the door splintering, felt the icy grip on her shoulder. She lay awake all night, staring at the ceiling, her mind filled with terrifying images. She knew she could never go back to that cabin, and she knew that whatever was out there wasn't finished with her. The next morning, after a fitful 3 hours of sleep, Sarah checked out of the motel and started the long drive back to Boston. The sun was shining, but the world seemed gray and lifeless to her. As she drove, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being followed. She kept glancing in the rearview mirror, but she saw nothing except the endless expanse of highway. She arrived back in Boston in the late afternoon, exhausted and emotionally drained. Her apartment felt strange and unfamiliar, as if she were seeing it for the first time. She took a long, hot shower, trying to wash away the dirt and the fear, but she knew that no amount of water could cleanse her of what she had experienced. That night, as she lay in bed, listening to the sounds of the city, she felt a sense of profound unease. She was safe now, back in her familiar surroundings, but she knew that the darkness she had encountered in Havenwood had followed her home. Back in her Boston apartment, life felt surreal. The vibrant city, usually a source of comfort and energy, now seemed to amplify her sense of isolation. The faces in the crowd appeared indifferent, oblivious to the terror she carried within. Sarah tried to resume her normal routine, but everything felt different. She went back to work, but she couldn't concentrate. The designs she usually poured her heart into now seemed meaningless and empty. She would stare out the window and notice the glowing red eyes she had seen on the road in Havenwood. Her colleagues noticed her changed demeanor. They asked if she was okay, if she needed anything. She just smiled weakly and told them she was fine, just tired. She couldn't bring herself to tell them what had happened. They wouldn't believe her. They'd think she was losing her mind. Emily, her friend, was the only one who seemed to sense the depth of her distress. She called Sarah every day, checking in on her, offering words of encouragement. "You need to talk about it, Sarah," Emily urged. "You can't just bottle it up inside. It will eat you alive." Finally, Sarah relented. She met Emily for coffee at a small cafe in the North End. Over steaming mugs of cappuccino, she poured out her story, recounting every terrifying detail of her weekend in Havenwood. As she spoke, Emily listened intently, her expression growing increasingly concerned. When Sarah finished, Emily reached across the table and took her hand. "Sarah, that's awful," Emily said, her voice soft. "I can't imagine what you've been through." Sarah burst into tears, the floodgates finally opening. "I don't know what to do, Emily," she sobbed. "I'm scared. I don't feel safe anywhere." Emily held her close, offering comfort and support. "It's okay, Sarah," she said. "You're not alone. We'll figure this out together." Emily suggested that Sarah see a therapist, someone who could help her process her trauma. Sarah was hesitant, but Emily convinced her that it was the best course of action. Sarah started seeing Dr. Eleanor Vance, a respected psychologist with an office in Back Bay. Dr. Vance was a kind, compassionate woman who listened patiently as Sarah recounted her experiences. Dr. Vance helped Sarah explore her fears and anxieties, teaching her coping mechanisms to manage her PTSD. She also suggested that Sarah try to find a logical explanation for what had happened in Havenwood, to dispel the supernatural elements that were haunting her. Sarah tried to follow Dr. Vance's advice, but it was difficult. The memories of that night were so vivid, so visceral. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had encountered something truly evil, something that defied rational explanation. One evening, while researching Havenwood online, Sarah stumbled across an old article about the town's history. It mentioned a series of strange disappearances that had occurred in the area in the late 18th century. According to the article, several settlers had vanished without a trace, their homes abandoned and their fates unknown. Some locals whispered about dark rituals and ancient curses, but the disappearances were never solved. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Could there be a connection between those disappearances and what she had experienced? Could the cabin in Havenwood be haunted by the spirits of the lost settlers? Driven by a need to understand, Sarah decided to return to Havenwood. She knew it was dangerous, but she couldn't rest until she had uncovered the truth. She went back to the police. They did not believe her, but they agreed to accompany her back to the cabin. She enlisted Emily's help, knowing she couldn't face this alone. Emily, ever the loyal friend, readily agreed. They packed their bags and set off for Havenwood, determined to confront the darkness that had invaded Sarah's life. They had called the police and asked them to accompany them to the cabin. Sarah bought a gun, a 9mm Beretta 92 FS, and a license to carry it. She had been taking lessons in the shooting range, and she was a good shot. The police didn't know about the gun. The drive back to Havenwood was even more unsettling than Sarah remembered. The landscape seemed darker, more menacing. The trees loomed over the road like silent watchers, their branches casting eerie shadows. Sarah and Emily arrived in Havenwood in the late afternoon, the sky already beginning to darken. The town was eerily quiet, the streets deserted. They found the police, and they drove in convoy to the cabin. The Whispering Pines cabin looked even more dilapidated and foreboding than before. The front door was still broken, hanging crookedly on its hinges. The windows were dark and empty, like vacant eyes staring out into the woods. Sarah felt a wave of nausea wash over her as she stepped out of the car. She could feel the darkness emanating from the cabin, a palpable presence that seemed to suck the air from her lungs. The police, two young officers named Miller and Davies, approached the cabin cautiously, their hands resting on their holstered weapons. They had agreed to search the cabin for any evidence of a break-in or any other criminal activity. Sarah and Emily followed behind, their hearts pounding in their chests. They had the loaded gun in Emily's purse. As they entered the cabin, a gust of wind swept through the open doorway, carrying with it the scent of dust and decay. The interior was even more desolate than Sarah remembered. The furniture was overturned, the floors littered with debris. The police began their search, carefully examining every room. They found nothing of significance. No signs of forced entry other than the broken door. No footprints, no fingerprints. It was as if no one had been there. Sarah wandered through the cabin, her eyes scanning the walls, the floors, the ceiling. She was looking for something, anything that could explain what had happened to her. She went into the bedroom and examined the closet. The strange symbols were still scrawled on the back wall, barely visible in the dim light. She reached out and touched them, feeling a strange energy tingling in her fingertips. Suddenly, she heard a scream from the living room. Sarah ran to the living room, her heart pounding in her chest. She found Emily standing in the center of the room, her face pale with terror. "What is it?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Emily pointed to the fireplace. "Look," she whispered. Sarah looked into the fireplace and gasped. Scrawled in the soot on the back wall were the same symbols that she had seen in the closet. But there was something else, something even more disturbing. Beneath the symbols, someone had written a message. It was written in blood. The message read, "Get out." The police officers were stunned. Sarah explained about the woman at the window and about the figure she had attacked with the keys. They started to believe her. They were not sure about the supernatural angle, but something very wrong had taken place in the cabin. At that moment, the lights went out. The cabin was plunged into total darkness. The officers pulled out their flashlights and scanned the room. Sarah reached into Emily's purse and pulled out the gun. "What was that?" Officer Miller asked. The beam of his flashlight landed on the front door. Standing in the doorway was the woman. Her eyes were wide and vacant, her expression unreadable. She raised a hand and pointed at Sarah. "You can't hide from me," she rasped. "I've been waiting for you." Chaos erupted. Officer Davies, startled, yelled and pointed his weapon at the woman, shouting for her to leave. The woman didn't respond to the warning. She floated slowly into the room, her eyes fixed on Sarah. "You can't stop what's coming," she hissed. "It's too late." Officer Miller fired his weapon. The bullet passed through the woman, as though she wasn't there. The woman didn't react. Sarah raised her gun and fired, but the bullet also went straight through the woman. Emily screamed and covered her ears. Panic set in. The officers were confused, scared. "What the hell is this?" Officer Miller shouted. The woman advanced towards Sarah. Sarah backed away. The police officers stood aside, not knowing what to do. Sarah was on her own. Emily was paralyzed with fear. The woman floated to Sarah, her eyes glowing with an unnatural light. She reached out and touched Sarah's face. Suddenly, Sarah felt a jolt of electricity surge through her body. She collapsed to the floor, her body convulsing. Sarah was experiencing a flashback. She was seeing the cabin as it was 100 years earlier. The forest was the same, but there was a glow in the sky. A group of people wearing robes performed a ritual under the full moon. The people were shouting incantations, raising their arms to the sky. In the center of the group was a young woman tied to a stake. She cried and begged for mercy, but the people ignored her. They continued their ritual, chanting louder and louder. The woman at the stake suddenly changed her appearance. She looked like Sarah. She had been sacrificed to some dark entity. The jolt stopped. Sarah lay on the floor, gasping for breath. The woman standing over her was no longer a ghost. She was a portal. A dark entity stood behind her, its form shifting and swirling. Sarah and Emily could clearly see the glowing red eyes in the darkness. The officers ran screaming into the woods, never to be seen again. The entity reached down and touched Sarah. The spirit was trapped in the cabin, but the entity could take her spirit and leave the woods. The entity whispered the final incantation from the ritual and took Sarah's spirit. Emily ran screaming out of the house and never stopped until she was back in Boston. Emily went back to the police. They did not believe her and considered her insane. There was no record of the two officers who went to the cabin with Sarah, or that Sarah had even rented the cabin. Emily was all alone. She knew that she was the only person who knew the truth about what had happened in Havenwood. She feared that the entity was after her next. One evening, Emily heard a scratching at her window. She pulled back the curtain and saw the woman's face. The woman smiled, and Emily knew that her time was up.